They said Lucian Blackthorne had never needed anyone. They built entire reputations on that belief, whispered it across ballrooms, engraved it into the social architecture of every noble house from London to the northern moors. The man who destroyed the Hartwell banking dynasty with a single letter. The man whose silence at dinner parties cost lords their seats in Parliament. When fever took him down in the dead of winter and every person who had sworn loyalty to his name vanished behind locked doors, the kingdom held its breath and waited for the death it had always half desired. What it got instead was something far more dangerous than a dead duke. It got a duke who finally saw clearly. The fever came on a Tuesday. Lucian Blackthorne remembered that detail with the precision of a man who had spent 37 years cataloging every weakness he had ever been forced to witness in others, because the moment the first wave of heat rolled through his chest while he stood in the doorway of the Cressmore tenant village, he recognized it for exactly what it was and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, not fear. He had burned fear out of himself before his 25th birthday, standing over his father's body in the same estate while the solicitors read the will aloud, and his uncles watched him with patient, predatory eyes. What he felt was something colder and more precise than fear. He felt the particular clarity that arrives only when a man understands that the machinery he has spent his entire life building is about to be tested by something that does not care about machinery at all. The village had been dying for 3 weeks. He had known about the outbreak. His steward, Aldous Fenwick, had submitted 3 separate written reports, with the careful, hedging language of a man who understood that bad news delivered to Lucian Blackthorne required architectural precision. But the reports had described numbers. Casualty tallies, grain supply projections, the economic calculus of pestilence. Standing in the mud of Crestmore with the January wind cutting sideways off the moors, Lucian understood that Aldous' reports had failed to describe the smell. He pulled his coat tighter and walked forward anyway, because retreating was not something he had ever learned to do convincingly, and because the 12 tenant farmers watching him from their doorways needed to see their duke do the thing that fear had prevented everyone else from doing. He walked straight into it. For 2 hours he moved through the sick houses, speaking to men and women burning in their beds with the same measured authority he used in the House of Lords. He arranged for the physician from Ashford to be summoned at twice the standard rate. He dictated supply orders to his secretary Graves, who followed 3 steps behind with a handkerchief pressed firmly over his nose and the expression of a man composing his own obituary in real time. He assessed, organized, and commanded with the clinical efficiency that had made him the most effective and most quietly despised peer in the northern counties. By the time he stepped back into his carriage for the return to Ravenspire, the first wave had become a sustained pressure behind his eyes, and the second wave arrived before the carriage had cleared the village boundary. He said nothing. He sat with his back straight and his gloves folded precisely in his lap and watched the gray countryside move past the window, and he thought with great methodical care about everything that needed to be arranged. Ravenspire arrived in the late afternoon gray, its towers cutting into a sky the color of old pewter. The estate had been in his family for 200 years. Lucian had never loved it, exactly. Love required a softness of investment that he had always considered professionally inconvenient. But he had understood it in the way a man understands a tool he has used for so long that it has become an extension of his own body. He walked from the carriage to the main doors without assistance, declined Fenwick's offered arm with a look that closed the discussion permanently, and made it to his study on the second floor before the third wave hit him with enough force that he had to grip the desk with both hands to keep standing. He stood there for a long moment, gripping mahogany, breathing through the heat that was now spreading from his chest into his limbs, with the systematic thoroughness of a hostile occupation. Then he straightened, moved to his writing desk, and began composing letters. He wrote to his solicitor in London. He wrote to the estate manager regarding winter provisions. He wrote to 2 members of Parliament whose cooperation he required on a land tenure bill currently stalled in committee. He wrote in his usual hand, precise and slightly compressed, the handwriting of a man for whom even penmanship was a form of discipline. It was not until he had sealed the 4th letter that his hand shook badly enough to blur the wax seal, and he sat back in his chair and permitted himself, for approximately 4 seconds, to acknowledge that he was in serious trouble. He rang for Fenwick. The steward arrived with the alert anxiety of a man who had served Lucian Blackthorne for 11 years and had developed exquisite sensitivity to atmospheric disturbance. He took one look at the Duke sitting gray-faced at his writing desk and went very still. Your Grace, I need the East Wing quarantine protocol activated, Lucien said. His voice came out level. He was pleased by that. My chambers, the adjoining dressing room, and the corridor to the back staircase. Full isolation. No one enters without my direct instruction. Fenwick's mouth moved. Your Grace, if I may, the physician from Ashford won't arrive until... I'm aware of the physician's timeline. I've arranged his schedule myself. Lucien set down the pen with precision. I need you to inform the Duchess that I am indisposed and that her household arrangements should continue undisturbed. Her rooms in the Western Wing are sufficiently distant to present no risk. Yes, Your Grace. A pause that carried the particular texture of a man selecting his next words with great care. And your sons? Lord Edmund and Lord Carver are currently... My sons are at liberty to make their own decisions. Something in Lucien's tone closed a door. As they always have been. Fenwick withdrew. Lucien sat in his study for another 20 minutes, finishing the letters, because he had committed to finishing the letters, and he had not built Ravenspire's administrative reputation on the habit of leaving correspondence incomplete. Then he stood, walked to his chambers, and collapsed. He came back to himself in fragments across the first 2 days, and what he came back to was darkness, heat, the sound of wind finding every gap in the ancient stone walls, and the particular silence of a house that has quietly emptied itself around a man it has decided to leave behind. He understood the silence. He had no illusions about it. He had spent 37 years being precisely the kind of man that people fled from the moment he stopped being useful, and now that he lay in his own bed, unable to threaten or command or organize, the social architecture he had constructed with such careful brutality was demonstrating its foundational principle with admirable clarity. He had built Ravenspire's loyalty on fear. And fear, it turned out, pointed both ways. The fever moved through him in waves with a rhythm that reminded him of bad negotiations, the apparent ebbing of one crisis revealing the approach of something worse. On the second night, he became briefly convinced that his father was standing in the corner of the room, and he told his father with cold precision exactly what he thought of the estate he had inherited and the family he had been born into. And when he came back to himself, he was not certain how much of it had been said aloud versus conducted entirely within the burning architecture of his own skull. He was aware distantly that he had not eaten. He was aware that the water carafe beside his bed had been empty for some period of time. He was aware that the fire had burned low enough that the cold was beginning to arrive at his bed from the sides of the room. He was not, on the third morning, aware of much beyond these facts when the door opened. He assumed it was Fenwick, finally finding enough courage to enter. He had prepared, somewhere in the surviving functional corner of his mind, a response that would be both specific and permanent in its effect on Fenwick's professional confidence. He turned his head toward the door, and it was not Fenwick. She was young. He registered that first, in the way a man registers irrelevant data before he has understood the situation. Young and slight, and dressed in the plain gray of the housekeeping staff, with dark hair pulled back from a face that was doing something unusual. It was not performing anything. There was no fear on it that he could detect, and no ambition, and no of the careful social calculation he had spent 3 decades learning to read at 50 paces. There was only a kind of focused attention, like someone arriving to do a specific job. She was carrying a tray. She set it on the side table as though she had done this every morning for years. "Who are you?" he said. His voice came out wrecked, rougher and quieter than he intended, which irritated him profoundly. She turned. "Clara Whitmore, Your Grace. 3rd floor housekeeping." She picked up the water carafe, assessed its emptiness, and moved toward the washroom with the economical purpose of someone who had already identified the priorities and was executing them in order. "You've been without water for at least 8 hours. The fire needs rebuilding, and the bedding wants changing." He stared at the ceiling for a moment, working with this. "I issued quarantine instructions," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." "Those instructions apply to the household staff." "Yes, Your Grace." She came back from the washroom with the filled carafe and poured water into the glass beside him. Her hands were steady. "I've read the quarantine protocols. The risk of transmission through the Cressmore strain is highest in the first 4 days. You're in day 3. She set the glass down within reach. "Would you like me to leave after you've had some water, or would you like me to see to the fire first?" He looked at her. She looked back at him with the same focused, unbothered attention, waiting with complete equanimity for his answer, as though the question of whether he wanted her to risk her life for his comfort was a matter of logistical preference. "The fire," he said. She crossed to the fireplace and began rebuilding it with the competent briskness of someone who had rebuilt fires in cold rooms at difficult hours for her entire working life. He watched her, which was the only thing he was capable of doing, and he noticed that she did not look at him while she worked. Not the avoidance of fear, but the genuine indifference of a person focused on the task at hand. "Where is Fenwick?" he said. "Mr. Fenwick is managing the estate from the servants' hall." A brief pause as she repositioned a log. "He has been sending written updates to the door every morning." "And the Duchess?" A pause that was slightly different in texture from the previous one. "Her Grace moved to the Western Tower 2 days ago, Your Grace. She has her personal maid and 3 footmen with her." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind found the window frame. "My sons." She was quiet for 3 full seconds, which told him everything before she spoke. "Lord Edmund and Lord Carver departed for London on the evening of the 2nd day." Her voice was even. "I believe they cited business with their solicitors." He received this information. He lay with it for a moment, turning it over, examining it without the pretense of surprise. "Of course they did," he said. He meant it completely without bitterness. Bitterness required the prior existence of expectations, and Lucien Blackthorne had not maintained expectations of his sons for a long time. What he felt instead was something more like the satisfaction of a theorem proven. The world behaved according to its nature, and he had always known its nature. And here was the confirmation, clean and exact. Clara finished with the fire, rose, and moved to the windows to check the latches against the wind. She still had not looked directly at him with the watchful, calculating attention he associated with everyone else in this house. She was simply doing the next required thing, and the next, with the unself-conscious purposefulness of a person who had decided on a course of action and was executing it. He found this, he realized, deeply strange. "You understand what the quarantine means," he said. "You could catch this." "Yes, Your Grace. And you're here anyway." She turned from the window and looked at him directly for the first time, and he saw that her eyes were dark brown and absolutely clear. "Someone has to be," she said. She said it without heroism, without the particular theatrical delivery that people used when they wanted credit for sacrifice. She said it the way someone states a fact that has already been resolved, the conclusion of reasoning that took place earlier and is no longer under discussion. He had no response prepared for this. He lay in his fever-wrecked bed and looked at the ceiling of his ancestral estate and discovered that for the first time in a very long time, he had nothing at all to say. She came back that evening. She came back the morning after that. She established a rhythm with the quiet authority of a person who has decided that rhythm is what the situation requires, and she built it out of the available materials: fire maintenance, water, medicine, from the household cabinet that she administered with a precision suggesting she had either training or experience with illness, and occasionally food that he managed in small amounts when the fever allowed it. She was not gentle with him in the way servants were usually gentle with masters. The performance of gentleness, the theatrical softness of people managing their own anxiety through the management of someone else. She was efficient and matter-of-fact, and when he was difficult, which he was, because 37 years of being the most powerful person in any room does not dissolve cleanly under fever, she handled it without apology and without particular deference. On the 4th night, when the fever spiked badly enough that he came briefly unmoored from the room and began issuing instructions to people who were not present, she spoke to him the way a person speaks to someone they need to bring back from somewhere. Clear, flat, direct. Not frightened. "Your Grace, look at the fire. You're in your chambers at Ravenspire. It's the 4th of January. He surfaced, looked at her. Her face was sharp in the candlelight, concentrating. "You're burning," she said. "I need you to stay still." "I have never," he said, with enormous and barely functional dignity, "been in the habit of following instructions." "I know," she said. "You can be difficult about it after your temperature comes down." Something moved across his face that he could not entirely control. He was not certain it wasn't an almost smile, which was an experience so foreign to the geography of his expression that he filed it away as a symptom of the fever. She pressed a cool cloth to his forehead, and he lay still, because she had asked him to. The 5th day brought the beginnings of a change. Not recovery exactly, but the fever losing some of its total authority, pulling back from full occupation to something more like contested terrain. He was able to sit up for portions of the day. He was able to eat half of what she brought him without the effort of it constituting the primary event of the hour. On the fifth evening, she sat in the chair beside his bed while he slept, and he woke to find her there with a book open in her lap. One of the volumes from his shelves, he realized, which meant she had taken it without asking, which struck him as the kind of small presumption that should have annoyed him and somehow did not. "What are you reading?" he said. She looked up without starting. "A history of the enclosure movement. It was on your shelf." "I know where my books are. You have good taste in political history, Your Grace. The analysis of land tenure law in the third chapter is exceptional." She said it simply, as a straightforward observation, with none of the self-conscious performance of a servant demonstrating that she could read. He studied her. "You're literate. My father was a school teacher before he died." She didn't look up from the page. "My mother kept his library. I had access to it until she died too, and then I had access to whatever I could find in the houses where I worked." "How long have you been at Ravenspire?" 3 years. "I don't recall seeing you." "No, Your Grace." She turned a page. "Most people in this house don't see the third-floor staff unless something needs cleaning." He received this without comment. He lay against his pillows looking at the ceiling, and he thought about the 30-odd rooms on this estate that he moved through daily, attended by people he processed primarily as functions. Fenwick for administration, Graves for correspondence, the kitchen staff for meals, the stable staff for horses. And he recognized, with the particular clarity that illness strips a man down to, that Clara Whitmore had been right 3 feet away from his daily life for 3 years, and he had genuinely not noticed she existed. He was not certain whether this said more about him or about the nature of a house like Ravenspire. "Tell me about your father," he said, because he was still sick enough that the normal architecture of conversation didn't feel entirely obligatory. She looked up, and something in her expression registered mild surprise at the question, the first sign of uncertainty he had seen from her. Then she settled back in the chair. "He taught at a village school outside of Coventry, classics mostly, and mathematics. He believed very strongly that the ability to read and reason was the only real protection ordinary people had against being completely at the mercy of people like—" She stopped. "People like me," he said. She met his eyes. "Yes, Your Grace." He was quiet for a moment. He wasn't wrong. She returned to her book. The nights were long, and the wind was continuous, and the fever still arrived at irregular intervals with enough force to render him temporarily non-functional. And Clara Whitmore sat in his chambers through those nights with a patience that was not the patience of obligation, but of someone who had made a private decision and intended to honor it. He began to talk to her. He was not certain when it started exactly, but by the 6th day the conversations had acquired a texture and continuity that had nothing to do with the logistics of his illness. They talked about the land tenure bill. She had opinions, careful and specific, informed by the enclosure history she had been reading through his library. They talked about the Crestmore village, and he found himself listening to her account of what the servants in great houses knew about tenant conditions that the lords of those houses never did. Because servants moved through the actual architecture of consequence rather than the performed architecture of power. She told him about a family in the east corridor of the estate, one of the tenant families, a couple with 4 children, who had been paying rent on land that had been repeatedly boundary adjusted without their knowledge or legal recourse. "Fenwick knows about this," Lucian said. "Yes, Your Grace." "He has not mentioned it to me." "No, Your Grace." He lay with this information, because he assumed I knew and condoned it, or because he assumed I didn't know and wouldn't want to. She was quiet for a moment. "I think," she said carefully, "that most people who work for powerful men learn very quickly which truths are professionally survivable." He looked at the ceiling. Outside, the wind moved across the moors. He thought about Fenwick's 11 years of carefully constructed reports, each one a piece of architecture designed to tell him exactly what Fenwick had calculated he wanted to hear. And he thought about the 37 years of information that had moved through this estate in the same mode, managed and filtered and shaped by the particular anxieties of people whose livelihoods depended on his reaction. He thought about how much of what he believed he knew about his own estate was the truth, and how much was the truth's carefully maintained shadow. "That's a particular kind of loneliness," he said. He said it without self-pity, clinical, the observation of a man cataloging a condition. Clara looked at him. "Yes," she said. It is. She said it the way she said most things, without judgment, without the performance of sympathy, without the reflexive movement toward comfort that people made when they were managing someone rather than responding to them. Just simple, undecorated acknowledgement. He looked at her face in the candlelight and thought, with the strange precision that illness strips a man down to, that she was the first person who had spoken to him honestly in this house in 11 years. He did not say this aloud. He was sick, not sentimental. The seventh night was the worst. The fever returned with a violence that swept away the tentative improvement of the previous 2 days and replaced it with something that felt like standing in a burning building and watching the exits close. His temperature climbed past the point where coherent thought was available to him in any continuous form, and he experienced the next several hours in fragments. The pressure of her hand on his wrist checking his pulse, the sound of her voice pulling him back when he drifted somewhere unrecognizable. The cold cloth on his face and neck returned again and again with an efficiency that had no room in it for despair. At some point during those hours, he said something to her that he could not afterward reconstruct with certainty. The fever's residue. He remembered the shape of it, not the words, but the territory they moved through, some admission about his father or his sons, or the specific quality of the silence that had filled Ravenspire after his wife had closed herself into the western tower. He came back to himself near dawn to find her still in the chair, awake, watching him with the alert stillness of a person who has been keeping watch. "You stayed," he said. His voice was wrecked again. "Yes, Your Grace. You could have. At that temperature, the risk. I know the risk." He looked at her. She looked back at him. The fire had burned low again, and she rose to tend it, moving through the gray pre-dawn of his chambers with the matter-of-fact efficiency that he had come to recognize as her particular mode. And he watched her and thought about the word that had surfaced, somewhere in the burning architecture of the previous night when he had tried to understand why she stayed. He had not found a satisfying answer. He was accustomed to understanding why people did things. He had spent his entire professional life performing a very accurate analysis of human motivation, and that analysis had consistently produced the same basic architecture. People acted in their self-interest, which could be material or social or psychological, but which was always traceable and therefore manageable. Clara Whitmore stayed in his chambers through a deadly fever because someone had to. And the reason someone had to was because she had decided it was true. He could not reduce this to the architecture he understood. He lay in his bed and he found, underneath the illness and the fever and the long cold weeks of everyone else's disappearance, something that felt like the beginnings of a question he had never thought to ask about the world. He was still holding the question 2 days later on the 9th morning when the fever broke. He knew it had broken before he opened his eyes. The quality of his body's occupation by the heat was different. The hostile authority of the previous 9 days had receded to something residual, a withdrawal rather than a presence. He was weak in the deep, granular way of a body that has spent a week in combat and lost weight doing it, but the siege was over. He opened his eyes to the familiar ceiling of his chambers. Morning light, thin and January gray through the heavy drapes. Clara was in the chair. She appeared to have been there all night again, and she was asleep. Finally asleep, he realized, for what might have been the first time in days, with her head tilted against the wing of the chair and the enclosure history open and face down in her lap. And she had dark circles under her eyes and a strand of hair that had escaped its pins to fall across her cheek. He looked at her for a long time in the gray morning quiet. He thought about the 9 nights. He thought about the sound of the door opening on the 3rd morning when everyone else had gone, and the precise, unbothered efficiency with which she had walked in and begun doing the next required thing. He thought about his father's ghost in the corner of the room, and the cold water at 2 in the morning, and the conversations about land tenure and enclosure, and the specific kinds of truth that people learned not to tell powerful men. He thought about what it cost. Not the risk of illness, because she had clearly made her calculation about that and was not going to revisit it, but the other cost. 9 nights of sitting with a man who had spent his entire life perfecting the art of being impossible to approach, in the dark, while the wind moved across the moors and everyone else pointed their cowardice in the direction of London. He was still looking at her when her eyes opened. She came alert quickly, with the trained watchfulness of someone who had learned that waking slowly was a luxury rarely available to her, and her eyes found him immediately, and she registered the change, the fever's absence, the quality of his stillness. with a precision that suggested she had been monitoring the indicators for long enough to recognize the difference. "The fever broke," he said. "Yes." She set the book aside and rose, crossing to him to press the back of her hand against his forehead with the practiced assessment of the previous 9 days. Her hand was cool and certain. "Last night, I think. Your breathing changed around 3. You were awake at 3. I was." She withdrew her hand. "You need broth, and then sleep. Real sleep. The body doesn't actually begin repairing until the temperature normalizes." She moved toward the door with the brisk purpose that meant she had already identified the next 3 priorities and was executing them. "Clara!" She stopped, turned. He was looking at her from his bed with an expression that she had not seen on his face before. Not the clinical authority of the first days, not the unguarded rawness of the worst nights, but something new, something that sat in the specific territory between gratitude and bewilderment. "Why?" he said. She understood the question. He could tell she understood it because she was quiet for exactly the right length of time, not hesitating, but receiving it honestly, the way she received everything else. "Because you were dying and everyone left," she said, and that seemed like something that mattered. She was matter of fact. She said it without heroism, without performance, without the careful social calculation of a person angling for reward or recognition. She said it the way she had said on the 3rd morning, "Someone has to be." The conclusion of a prior reasoning that was not under reconsideration. He looked at her. 9 nights moved through the space between them. "You are," he said, "not what I expected." "No, Your Grace," she said. "I don't imagine I am." She went to get the broth. He lay in his bed in the thin January light, in the silence of Ravenspire, and he looked at the ceiling and felt the weight of the 9 days settling into him alongside the weight of something else, something that he could not yet name clearly, but that had the quality of a door that had been standing locked for a very long time and had just, without ceremony or announcement, come open. Outside, the snow had stopped. The moors were white and still, and somewhere in the western tower of Ravenspire, behind 3 closed doors and the particular architecture of her own self-preservation, Duchess Evelyn Blackthorne sat with her personal maid and waited for news of her husband's condition. She was waiting for it to be over. What she did not know, what she could not yet know, was that the man who had nearly died in the East Wing over the previous 9 days was not the man who was going to walk out of them. The Duke she had married, the one built on fear and precision and the elegant brutality of uncontested authority, was still present. But there was something else now, growing in the space the fever had scoured clean. And that evening, when Fenwick finally knocked at the quarantine corridor door to deliver the estate's accumulated correspondence, and Lucien received it in his dressing gown looking hollowed and clear-headed simultaneously, the first letter he opened was from Edmund. His eldest son wrote with the careful legal precision of a man who had not abandoned his father so much as correctly assessed that his father's illness presented an administrative opportunity. The letter was 3 pages. It outlined, with impressive technical detail, a proposal for the restructuring of the Blackthorne estate holdings that would transfer primary control of the northern properties to Edmund's management during what he tactfully described as any extended period of incapacitation. Lucien read the letter twice. He folded it with careful precision. He set it on the writing desk beside Carver's letter, which he had not yet opened, but which he already understood would contain something structurally similar, and he sat for a long moment in the quiet of his chambers while the fire Clara had rebuilt that morning burned steadily in the grate. He thought about Edmund's face. He thought about the specific quality of the relationship he had with his sons, which was architecturally identical to the relationship he had with every other person who moved through the power structure of his life, built on calculation, maintained through authority, absent of anything that would survive the removal of those 2 elements. He thought about what Clara had said on the 6th night about the truths that were professionally survivable. He picked up a pen. He began to write a response to Edmund that was 4 sentences long and conveyed, with complete precision and zero ambiguity, exactly where Lucien Blackthorne stood on the question of incapacitation. He sealed the letter. He put it with the outgoing correspondence. And then Clara came back with the broth, and she pulled the chair to its familiar position beside his bed, and the fire burned, and outside the moors were white, and the silence of Ravenspire held its particular quality. Not empty now, but waiting. He was going to recover. He was going to stand up from this bed and walk back out into the estate and resume the machinery of his life, and the Duchess would emerge from her tower, and his sons would return from London with their proposals and their calculations, and the household would reorganize itself around the fact of his survival. All of that was coming. He understood it precisely. What he did not understand, lying in his bed in the thin winter light, with the broth growing warm on the side table and Clara Whitmore reading his books 3 feet away, was how any of it was going to feel the same. He was still holding that question when the knock came. Not Fenwick's knock, not the careful administrative rhythm of 11 years of studied deference. This was a different knock entirely, sharp, assured, with the particular weight of someone who had decided that enough time had passed, and that whatever complications existed on the other side of the door were now, officially, her problem to manage. Clara looked up from her book. Lucienne looked at the door. "Your Grace," Evelyn's voice came through the oak, smooth as ever, carrying the exact calibration of concern that had always made it impossible to determine where her performance ended and her actual feeling, if she possessed actual feeling, began. "I understand the fever has broken. I think it's time we talked." Clara set her book down quietly. She rose because the protocols of the household were still the protocols of the household, and began gathering the medical implements from the side table with the unhurried efficiency of a person who had no intention of being present for whatever was about to happen. Lucian watched her move. He watched the way she did not look at the door, did not perform any reaction to the voice on the other side of it, simply continued doing the task in front of her with the same focused calm she brought to everything. "You can stay," he said quietly. She paused, looked at him. "You've been here for 9 nights," he said. "You can stay for this." Clara stood still for a moment with the medical kit in her hands and the look on her face of a person calculating something serious. Then she set the kit back down. Lucian Blackthorne straightened against his pillows. He was still pale, still hollowed by 9 days of fever, still wearing the dressing gown of a man who had been critically ill. He was not, at this precise moment, physically formidable, but something in his eyes had changed, some quality of the authority that had always lived there, sharpened now by 9 days of having nothing to perform it for, stripped of the theatrical layer that power required, and left with something more fundamental underneath. "Come in," he said. The door opened, and Eveline Blackthorne entered the room she had not entered for 9 days, and she looked at her husband, and she looked at the servant girl who was still standing beside his bed. And in the cold air of that moment, the temperature of the next several months was set. Eveline Blackthorne did not look at the servant girl the way a woman looks at a threat. She looked at her the way a woman looks at something she intends to remove from a room, with the patient technical assessment of a person who has already decided on the outcome and is simply confirming the logistics. She was 41 years old and had been beautiful her entire life, in the particular way of women who understood beauty as infrastructure rather than gift, maintained, deployed, and never wasted. She wore gray silk at 9 in the morning in a sick room because she understood that elegance was a form of argument, and she had arrived to argue. "Clara," she said. The name landed like something set down on a table with deliberate care. "You may go." Clara did not move immediately, which was itself a thing that happened in the room. Lucien watched it. He watched the half-second where Clara's eyes moved to him, not for permission, exactly, but with the clear-eyed assessment of someone determining whether the instruction had the authority behind it that the tone implied. "She stays," Lucien said. Eveline's gaze moved from Clara to her husband with the slow precision of someone making a recalibration. She took in his face, the pallor, the weight loss, the dressing gown, the 9 days of illness written into the architecture of him, and he watched her file all of it, and he watched her reach the part where she filed Clara's continued presence. "You've been through an ordeal," Eveline said. She moved to the chair beside the window, not the chair Clara had occupied for 9 nights, but the one farther from the bed, positioned for conversation rather than care. She sat with the composed grace of a woman who had spent 20 years practicing the art of being the most controlled person in any room. "I imagine your judgment is still affected." "My judgment is fine," Lucien said. "Then perhaps your manners are affected." She looked at Clara again, and this time there was something different in it, the first real edge, just visible beneath the silk. "This is a private conversation." "She stays," Lucien said again. The room held that. Eveline looked at her husband for a long moment, and something moved across her face. Not hurt, because Eveline did not traffic in hurt, but a rapid internal calculation, the speed of a woman who had navigated 20 years of marriage to this particular man and understood, with the bone-deep expertise of proximity, when something had shifted. She had expected to find him weakened. She had prepared for that version. She was adjusting. "Very well," she said, and folded her hands in her lap. And the conversation moved into its next phase with the quality of a chess game where both players have understood since the opening that no one is going to win cleanly. "You should have sent word," Lucian said. "I sent Fenwick every day." "Fenwick is not you." "No," she agreed. "He's considerably less likely to contract a fatal illness by entering your chambers." She said it without apology, with the flat rationality of a woman who believed entirely in the correctness of her own risk assessment. "I have the household to manage, Lucien. I have our sons to consider. You would have made the same calculation." "I wouldn't have," he said. "But we've understood that about each other for some time." She looked at him. He looked back at her. 20 years of marriage compressed itself into the space between them. Not warmth, exactly, and not only coldness, but the dense, specific texture of two people who had been bound by contract and convenience long enough that they had developed something more complicated than either. "You look terrible," she said. "I nearly died." "Yes." A pause. "I'm aware." And in that pause, just there, in the 2 seconds where the performance of her composure held perfectly still, he caught something. Not grief, not quite, but something adjacent to it, something that suggested that behind the Western Tower and the locked doors and the 11-year marriage of strategic coexistence, there existed some version of Evelyn Blackthorne that had registered his near death as something other than an administrative problem. He noted it. He did not soften toward it. "Edmund wrote to me," he said. Her hands did not move in her lap. "I know." "You know." "He consulted me before he sent it." She met his eyes directly. "He's concerned about the estate. The northern properties need active management. He proposed to transfer control while I was still burning with fever." Lucian's voice stayed level. Level was its most dangerous register, and she knew it. "He wrote the letter on the 4th day. He did not know yet whether I would survive." Eveline was quiet for 3 full seconds. "He was being practical. He was being a vulture. Still level. The distinction matters to me, if not to him." "You raised him to be practical, Lucien. You can't build a son in your own image and then fault the craftsmanship." It landed. He acknowledged it internally. It was a good point, delivered with the surgical precision that had always been one of Eveline's genuine skills, and he did not let it show. "I raised him to be practical about other people's weakness," he said. "Not mine." And there it is. Her voice was still smooth, but something had entered it. 20 years, and that's still the entire architecture of it. Your strength, everyone else's weakness. Your decisions, everyone else's logistics. She glanced toward Clara for the first time in several minutes, and the glance was not hostile. It was something colder than hostile. Assessing. 9 days in this room with a servant girl, and you've apparently decided that's changed. Clara stood very still. She had not spoken since Eveline entered. She had done exactly what she had always done in the rooms of this estate. She had been present without being visible, inhabiting the space with the trained invisibility of a woman who had spent her entire working life learning that most rooms were safer when you didn't draw attention to yourself. But she was watching Eveline, and Eveline, who missed very little, had noticed. "What's your name?" Eveline said to her. Direct, without the performance of kindness, which was in its own way more honest than the alternative. "Clara Whitmore, Your Grace." "How long have you been in this house?" 3 years, Your Grace." "And in those 3 years you've apparently become indispensable." She said it without inflection, not cruel, not kind, just exact. "Remarkable." "She stayed," Lucian said, while everyone else made their calculations. Eveline turned back to him. "I made decisions to protect myself and our sons. You would have done the same." "I would not." "You walked into the Cressmore village because it demonstrated strength, not because it demonstrated anything about your actual capacity for—" She stopped. Reconsidered. She was too precise to finish a sentence that would prove his point. "You were not staying for anyone, Lucien. You were performing. There's a difference." He looked at her for a long time. Outside, the January wind moved across the estate. The fire crackled in the grate. "Leave," he said. She rose. She did it with perfect composure, no hurry, the movement of a woman who is choosing to exit a room rather than being removed from it. At the door she paused, and she looked back. Not at him, but at Clara, and the look lasted just long enough to contain everything it needed to contain. Then she left. The door closed with a quiet precision that was somehow more final than a slam. Lucien sat in the aftermath of it. Clara stood at the side table with the medical kit, her back partly to him, and he watched her process what had just happened in the controlled stillness of a person who had learned that visible reaction was a luxury she could not afford. "She'll make it difficult for you," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." Clara's voice was even. "That concerns me." She turned, looked at him with those dark, clear eyes. "It shouldn't." She picked up the broth. "You need to eat." He ate. He did not argue. And for the first time in 9 days, the silence between them had a different quality. Not the silence of a sick room, but the silence of two people sitting with the knowledge that something had happened in the last 20 minutes that could not be unhappened. He was on his feet by the 12th day. Not strong. He was precise about that distinction, refusing the performance of recovery that would have cost him more than it bought, but functional. He moved through the estate with the careful deliberateness of a man relearning the geography of his own authority, and he watched how it reorganized itself around his presence. Fenwick returned to his normal posture of attentive efficiency, bringing with him the accumulated paperwork of 9 days and the particular manner of a man who is working very hard not to reference the 9 days directly. The kitchen staff resumed their normal operations. The footmen found their positions again in the corridors, snapping to appropriate attention with the slightly overcorrected alertness of people compensating for recent lapses. The house reformed itself around him like water resuming its shape after a stone has passed through it. He watched all of it. He watched it with the same eyes he had always used, precise, diagnostic, the eyes of a man who understood power as a system and had spent his entire adult life as its primary engineer in this particular environment. The same eyes, different conclusions. Edmund arrived on the 14th day from London, which told Lucien that someone in the house had informed him of the recovery timeline with sufficient accuracy that he had calibrated his return accordingly. He came with Carver, which suggested coordination, which suggested a conversation had taken place before the return that was more strategic than fraternal. His sons were 28 and 26. Edmund had Lucien's build and his mother's eyes and had spent his entire life deploying both to maximum social advantage. Carver was softer, physically and otherwise, not weak, but the kind of man who preferred to operate through other people's actions rather than his own, which Lucien had always privately considered the more dangerous approach. They met in the study. Edmund entered with the careful confidence of a man who had prepared for several versions of this conversation and was ready to adapt. He took in his father's appearance, the thinness, the recovered sharpness of expression, and made his rapid recalibration without letting it show. Almost without letting it show. "Father," Edmund extended his hand. "You look well, considering." "Considering," Lucien agreed. He shook his son's hand, he shook Carver's. He gestured toward the chairs. He sat behind his desk. The architecture of the room did its usual work. Him behind the desk, them in the chairs in front of it, the whole arrangement speaking a language that this family had spoken for 3 decades. "Your letter," Lucien said. Edmund had prepared for this. Lucien watched him execute the preparation. The slight forward lean, the measured tone, the language that reframed self-interest as concern. "I was managing a crisis. You were critically ill, the estate was running without clear direction, and someone needed to ensure continuity. You wrote it on the 4th day." "Yes." "You didn't know I would survive." "No, I didn't." Edmund held his gaze. This, at least, was honest, which is exactly why contingency planning was necessary. "You've always said—" "I know what I've always said." Lucien's voice did not rise. It never rose. "I've said a great deal of things over 20 years of raising you, and you've been a very attentive student. I'm aware of that." He paused. "What I'm curious about is at what point you informed your mother." The room held that. Carver looked at the carpet. Edmund's expression moved through 3 small adjustments. "She's part of the estate management structure. She's not on the legal documents. Try again." "We consulted her because she has operational knowledge of the household," Edmund said. "That's all." "The 2 of you left on the evening of the 2nd day," Lucien said. Your mother sealed herself into the western tower on the morning of the second day. The timing is interesting. Father, one of you will tell me what the conversation was. It will either be you, now, or I will reconstruct it from the correspondence, which I will be reviewing this week. The second version will be less comfortable for everyone involved. Carver looked at his brother. Something passed between them. The rapid, involuntary communication of people who have grown up in the same house learning the same survival skills. Edmund said, "She told us the physician had given it less than even odds. She said if we stayed and became ill, there would be no one to manage the estate's transition. She said it was what you would want." The room was very quiet. Lucian sat behind his desk and looked at his eldest son's face, and he thought about the word transition, and he thought about the word want, and he felt somewhere in his chest the particular cold settling of a man who has just confirmed something he already knew, but had not yet seen written out cleanly. "Get out," he said. Edmund rose. Carver rose. At the door, Edmund turned back, and for just a moment, underneath the preparation and the strategy and the 28 years of learning to read his father's silences, there was something that looked almost like a sun. "We thought you were going to die," he said. "That's not a strategy. That's just what we thought." Lucian looked at him. "I know," he said. "That's the part that's not your fault." They left. He sat alone in his study for a long time with the fire and the accumulated correspondence and the gray January light through the windows. And he thought about what it meant to build a family the way he had built everything else, through dominance and system and the careful elimination of variables that could not be controlled, and what the inevitable output of that construction looked like when the system was tested. He had the answer now. He had had it, really, since the third morning when the door opened and it was Clara and not anyone else. He picked up his pen. He set it down. He stared at the wall. It was in this configuration, alone, still, with the weight of 9 days and 14 recovery days and 40 years of careful architecture sitting in the room with him, that his steward knocked and opened the door 3 inches. "Your Grace, I apologize for the interruption." Fenwick's voice carried the specific frequency of bad news being carefully managed. "There is a situation in the servants' hall that requires your attention." "What situation?" A pause. "Mrs. Hartley has informed Clara Whitmore that her position is no longer required." Another pause. "On the instruction of the Duchess." Lucian was still for 1 full second. Then he stood up. He crossed the study in 8 steps, opened the door fully, and looked at Fenwick with an expression that the steward would later describe, to his wife in private, as the face of a man who has just decided something permanent. "Where is she?" "The servants' hall, Your Grace. Mrs. Hartley gave her an hour to collect her belongings." He walked. He walked through the main corridor and down the back staircase and through the door to the servants' hall with the contained velocity of a man in whom controlled anger had reached the specific temperature where it becomes something else. Not rage, which was inefficient, but the cold, absolute certainty of a person who has made a decision that will not be revisited. The servants' hall went silent when he entered it. Clara stood near the far wall with her coat on and a small traveling bag at her feet. Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper, stood nearby with the rigid composure of a woman who had been following instructions and had not entirely anticipated this outcome. 3 other servants were frozen at the table. Lucien looked at Clara. She looked back at him. She was not performing distress. She was not crying. She had the settled, clear-eyed expression of a woman who had made her calculations and accepted them. The same expression she had worn on the 3rd morning when she walked through a quarantine door, the expression of someone who has already resolved the cost and is done grieving it. That expression, more than anything else, was what did it. "You did not authorize this," he said to Mrs. Hartley. Not a question. "The Duchess instructed me, Your Grace. The Duchess does not manage estate staffing. That authority is mine." His voice was level and absolute. "Clara Whitmore's position is reinstated, effective immediately." Mrs. Hartley looked like a woman standing between 2 forces and understanding with sudden clarity that she had badly miscalculated which one was more dangerous. "Your Grace, the Duchess was very specific, and I am more specific." He looked at Clara. "You'll remain in your position." Clara held his gaze for a moment. Something moved across her face. Not relief exactly, but something more complicated. The expression of a person receiving a thing they had not asked for and were not certain they should accept. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "this will make things harder for you." "Yes," he said, "it will." He said it the way she had said things, without performance, without the architecture of strategy, just the plain statement of a fact that had been assessed and accepted. The servants' hall held its silence. Somewhere above them, in the western wing of the house, Evelyn Blackthorne would receive word of this within the hour, and she would understand, with the diagnostic precision that had always been her genuine gift, exactly what had happened and what it meant. Clara picked up her traveling bag, set it back down. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said. He nodded once and turned and walked back toward the main house. And in the cold corridor with his hands at his sides, and the absolute quiet of a house that had just witnessed something it would not stop talking about for weeks, Lucien Blackthorne felt the ground shift beneath the entire structure of the life he had built. He had made a choice in the servants' hall that had nothing to do with efficiency or authority or any of the languages he had spent 40 years learning to speak. He had made it because she had stood there with her coat on and her traveling bag at her feet and the clear-eyed acceptance of a woman who had already let go. And it had been intolerable to him in a way he did not yet have the vocabulary for. He would need to find the vocabulary, because Eveline had seen it. And Eveline, who had survived 20 years of marriage to him by being the most precise reader of power in any room, had understood what the servants' hall meant before he had understood it himself. And 3 floors above him, in the western tower, she was already deciding what to do about it. The letter from Eveline's solicitor arrived on a Thursday. Lucien recognized the firm's letterhead before he broke the seal. Ashworth and Crane, the oldest family law practice in London, retained by the Pemberton family for 3 generations, and therefore by Evelyn for the entirety of their marriage. He had always known the name existed in the background of things, the way a man knows a loaded weapon is in the house without thinking about it daily. He read the letter standing at his desk. It was 4 pages. The language was the polished architectural precision of men who had spent careers building sentences that could not be broken under pressure. And what it described, calmly, methodically, with the complete absence of personal feeling that made legal documents so much more devastating than accusations, was a petition for legal separation on grounds of abandonment of marital duty, misappropriation of estate funds, and conduct unbecoming a peer of the realm. The 3rd charge was the one that mattered. It was the one Evelyn had built the document around, the one that gave Ashworth and Crane their real leverage, because conduct unbecoming encompassed, with strategic legal flexibility, everything that had happened in the servants' hall. He set the letter down. He picked it up again. He read the 3rd charge a second time, with the particular attention of a man who is looking for the exact shape of the trap he has walked into. There it was. Not Clara's name, not yet. The first letter was always architecture, not execution, but the shape of her was in it, the outline of a servant girl in a duke's chambers, 9 nights of proximity, and a reinstatement order issued by the Duke himself in direct contradiction of his wife's household authority. Eveline had not wasted time. He had underestimated the speed of her response, which was itself a failure of analysis he should not have made. He had known her for 20 years. He had watched her manage crises with the cold efficiency of a general who never moved until she understood the complete terrain. He should have moved first. He sat down. He sat in his study with the fire going, and the January light coming through the windows, and the letter in his hands, and he thought with great precision about the specific texture of the position he now occupied. He was a duke who had nearly died of fever. His sons had attempted an estate transfer during his illness. His wife had retained London's most formidable family law firm within 2 weeks of his recovery and filed a separation petition that weaponized his behavior in the servants' hall. The estate staff had witnessed the reinstatement order. Fenwick had witnessed it. The 3 servants at the table had witnessed it. The machinery of it was elegant. He could acknowledge that, coldly, the way a man acknowledges the quality of a blade that is cutting him. He rang for Fenwick. When the steward arrived, Lucien looked at him for a long moment before speaking. He looked at him with the diagnostic attention he had applied to everything in the past 2 weeks. The new attention, the one the fever had stripped him down to, that did not accept the surface presentation of things. Fenwick was 53. He had been at Ravenspire since Lucien's father's time, had transferred his professional loyalty to Lucien with the smooth competence of a man who understood that institutional survival required seamless transitions. He was efficient, discreet, and had spent 11 years providing Lucien with carefully filtered information. "When did you know about the solicitor?" Lucien said. The silence lasted exactly 1 second too long. "Your Grace, when?" Fenwick's composure held, It was a professional composure, the kind built through decades of managing difficult conversations, and it held right up until the moment it understood that the man behind the desk was not asking whether he knew, but confirming that he already knew the answer. "The Duchess consulted me about estate documentation 3 days ago," Fenwick said. "Financial records, correspondence logs. I provided what she requested. She is entitled to request household records, Your Grace. I didn't have grounds to refuse." "You had grounds to tell me." Another pause. "I thought it was a domestic matter that would resolve itself." Lucian looked at him for a long time. He looked at him with the complete attention of a man cataloging 11 years of carefully managed information, and he felt the specific quality of the ground shifting again. Not the way it had shifted in the servants' hall, which had been about something being built, but the way it shifted now, which was about something being dismantled. "You thought," Lucian said, "that it was worth managing from both sides." Fenwick said nothing. His silence was its own answer, and they both understood it. "Get out of my study," Lucian said. "I'll determine what your position looks like by the end of the week." Fenwick left with the careful dignity of a man who had just watched a career's worth of safety begin to come apart at the seams, and Lucian sat alone in the room with the solicitor's letter and the accumulated understanding of the last 20 minutes, and he breathed. He breathed with conscious control, the way he had stood in the Crestmore doorway. Not because breathing solved anything, but because the body needed management when the mind was processing something that had no clean resolution. Someone in this house had been talking to Eveline for weeks. The documentation Fenwick had provided was part of it, but documentation alone did not build a legal case of this architecture. Ashworth and Crane had been briefed with a comprehensiveness that required time, detail, and intimate knowledge of the estate's internal operations. He thought about Edmund's letter, drafted on the 4th day of the fever. He thought about the coordination of the departure. Both sons, the same evening, after a conversation with their mother. He thought about the letter arriving exactly when it did, calibrated to the specific window of his recovery where he would be strong enough to read it, but not yet strong enough to have rebuilt his full operational awareness of the estate's internal landscape. They had been planning this while he was dying, not Eveline alone. Edmund, certainly, possibly Carver, though Carver's involvement was likely the passive variety, agreement rather than engineering, and Fenwick, whose provision of documentation had been the pivot point that turned a domestic dispute into a legal action. He picked up a pen. He wrote 3 words on a piece of paper. He looked at the 3 words for a moment. Then he went to find Clara. Listen. She was in the east corridor, 3rd floor, doing the work she had always done. He found her without asking anyone where she was, which itself was a changed thing. A month ago, he would not have known which floor she worked on. She looked up when she heard his step. She read his face with the diagnostic speed she had developed across 9 nights of reading him in the dark, and she set down what she was carrying and waited. "I need to tell you something," he said. They went to the small room at the end of the corridor, a linen storage room, the only room on the floor without traffic. And he told her about the letter. He told her plainly, without the architecture of management, because he had learned over 9 nights that she handled plain truth better than constructed versions of it. She listened without interrupting. She had the absolute stillness of a person receiving information that is serious and needs to be fully received before any response is possible. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The 3rd charge," she said. "That's about me." "Yes." "She'll put my name in the next letter." "Yes." Clara looked at the wall. He watched her process it. Not with fear, he noted, but with the careful, pragmatic attention of a woman who had spent her entire life assessing the real shape of situations rather than the comfortable version. "I should leave," she said, "before it gets worse." "No." She looked at him. "Running doesn't close the case," he said. "It confirms it. Ashworth and Crane will use your departure as an admission. Eveline knows that. The goal of the first letter is to make you leave voluntarily." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "You've thought about this carefully." "I've thought about very little else since 9 o'clock this morning." She was quiet. Then, "What do you need from me?" He looked at her face in the dim light of the linen room and thought about the specific quality of that question. Not what will you do for me? Not how does this affect me? But what do you need? The question of someone who has already placed themselves on a particular side of a line and is asking for their assignment. He had spent 40 years surrounded by people who asked variations of what does this cost me? The difference in register was significant. Stay visible, he said. Do your work normally. Don't hide, don't change your behavior, don't give anyone a version of events to narrate. And you? I'm going to London. I need my own solicitor, and I need to understand the complete documentation Fenwick provided before Ashworth and Crane have time to build the structure further. She nodded. She was already recalibrating, already orienting herself toward the practical shape of what came next. He recognized the movement. It was what she did. It was, he understood now, one of the things he had come to rely on without naming it. Be careful on the road, she said. You're still not fully recovered. It was such a practical thing to say, at the end of such a conversation, that he stood with it for a moment in the linen storage room of his ancestral estate. I'll be back in 4 days, he said. He left for London the next morning. He was back in 3. He came back with his own solicitor, a sharp, combative man named Reeves, who had spent 30 years doing to other people's legal cases exactly what Ashworth and Crane intended to do to his, and he came back with a clearer picture of the documentation landscape, and he came back with something else. A piece of information his London contacts had surfaced that changed the shape of the situation entirely. Eveline had been in correspondence with Lord Aldrich Pemberton, her eldest brother, since before the fever. Before. The letters his investigator had recovered, through methods Lucien did not require to be explained to him, showed a conversation that had begun in November, 2 months before the Crestmore outbreak, and that had concerned, with a specificity that removed any possibility of coincidence, the legal mechanisms by which a duchess could separate from a duke, while retaining a significant portion of the estate's northern property holdings. November. Before the fever. Before Clara. Before the servants' hall. The separation petition was not a response to his behavior. It was a plan that his behavior had accelerated but not created. He sat in his carriage for the last hour of the return journey with this information, and he let it do what it needed to do. Move through the structures of his understanding, dismantle the things it needed to dismantle, rearrange the landscape. He thought about 20 years. He thought about the particular quality of what he had believed his marriage to be, not love, never love, but a contract maintained by mutual understanding and mutual self-interest, a piece of machinery that both parties had agreed to operate according to its design. He had believed that Eveline, whatever else she was, had honored the contract. She had been planning the exit for at least 2 months before he almost died in his own bed. She had watched him burn with fever in the East Wing and understood it as an accelerant, and she had moved accordingly. He thought about November. He thought about what had been happening in November. The land tenure bill, the parliamentary sessions, the 3 weeks he had spent in London while she managed Ravenspire, and he thought about what Eveline had been doing during those 3 weeks with access to the estate's records and Fenwick's cooperative nature and her brother's legal contacts. The machinery of it was not elegant from this angle. From this angle, it was simply what it was, a betrayal conducted with patience and precision by a woman who had decided on her exit and built it carefully, and who had then found, in his near death and his behavior in the servants' hall, the perfect public narrative to accelerate a private plan. He arrived at Ravenspire in the early evening. Fenwick met him at the door, which Lucien found interesting. "Where is the Duchess?" he said. "In the dining room, Your Grace. She is hosting Lord Pemberton. He arrived this afternoon." Lucien stopped moving for 1 full second. Then he handed his coat to the footman and walked toward the dining room. He could hear them before he reached the door. The low, composed register of 2 people conducting a conversation they believed to be private. Pemberton's voice, older and heavier than he remembered from their last meeting 2 years ago, and Eveline's, smooth as always, with the particular undertone of a woman who is very close to the outcome she has been working toward. He opened the door. The dining room held them both, Eveline at the head of the table with a glass of wine, Pemberton across from her with the substantial physical presence of a man who had spent 60 years being the largest person in most rooms. They both looked up. The look on Pemberton's face moved through 3 adjustments in rapid succession. Surprise, recalibration, the settling into a prepared position. Eveline's face did not move at all. "Lucien," she said, "we weren't expecting you until tomorrow. I made good time." He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the 2 of them at his dining table in his estate. Then he walked to the sideboard, poured himself a glass of water, and sat down at the far end of the table. "Aldrich, it's been 2 years. "Lucien," Pemberton's voice was careful. "I heard about the fever. Glad to see you've recovered. I'm sure you are." He looked at Eveline. She looked back at him with the composed attention of a woman who has been preparing for this confrontation and has decided which version of herself to bring to it. You started writing to Aldrich in November. The room held that. Pemberton started to speak. Lucian held up one hand without looking at him, and 20 years of being Lucian Blackthorne's brother-in-law was enough for Pemberton to understand that the hand meant stop, and the instruction was not decorative. "I know about the November letters," Lucian said to Evelyn. "I know about the property consultation. I know what Fenwick provided, and when." He paused. "I want to hear you say it." She looked at him for a long time. And then, and this was the thing that he had not expected, the thing that genuinely surprised him, which very few things did anymore. She did not deflect. "I was protecting myself," she said. "I've been protecting myself for 20 years. You built this estate into a machine and you put everyone in it into the machine, and I decided a year ago that I was not going to be inside it when it eventually broke." She picked up her wine glass, set it down. "The fever wasn't the beginning of this, Lucian. You know that." "I know that now." "Oh, I didn't use the girl." Her voice was precise. "Whatever you think the case is built on, I want you to understand that I was planning this before she existed in your life. She's incidental." He looked at his wife. This woman he had lived beside for 20 years without ever fully seeing, he understood now. Because seeing her clearly would have required a quality of attention he had reserved entirely for the management of everything else. And he felt, underneath the cold clarity of the situation, something that was not quite grief but lived in the same territory. "I know she's incidental," he said. "That's not the part that matters." "Then what matters?" "November," he said, 2 months before the fever, while I was in London." A pause. "You looked me in the face for 3 weeks after I came back and you were already building the exit." The silence in the dining room was a specific quality of silence. Pemberton was looking at the table. Evelyn was looking at her husband. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He picked up his water glass. He set it down. "Then we understand each other," he said. Finally. He stood. He looked at Pemberton, who had the uncomfortable expression of a man who has arrived to support his sister in a planned confrontation and has found himself instead at the edge of something rawer and more specific than strategy. "You're welcome to stay the night, Aldrich," Lucian said. "The weather's poor." He moved toward the door. "But the property consultation is over. Whatever Evelyn has told you about the Northern Holdings, I'd advise you to consider it preliminary." He walked out. He walked through the corridor and up the main staircase, and he stood at the top of the stairs for a moment in the dark quiet of the house, with both hands on the rail, and he breathed in the particular cold air of Ravenspire, and he let the full weight of the evening settle. 40 years. He had built this life over 40 years with the precision and discipline of a man who believed that sufficient control was sufficient protection. He had built the estate, the title, the reputation, the political influence, the marriage, all of it constructed according to the same principle. Manage the variables. Eliminate the vulnerabilities. Never expose the things that can be taken. What the November letters showed him was that the construction had been hollow at its center for years, that the people he had built it with had been conducting their own private calculations in the walls of it all along. He had been the last to know the shape of his own life. He stood at the top of the stairs in the dark house, and he felt the specific vertigo of a man whose architecture has just revealed its foundational cracks. And he understood, with the bone-deep clarity that only arrives when the comfortable versions of things have been removed, that the person who had walked into Ravenspire before the fever could not navigate what came next. That man had been built for a world that had just shown him its actual face. He heard a sound, soft, at the end of the corridor. The third-floor staircase door, opening and closing with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned long ago to move through this house without drawing attention. Clara was coming down from the upper floors. She was carrying a candle and a folded piece of linen, and she had not yet seen him standing at the top of the main staircase, and he watched her in the dark for a moment. This woman who had walked into his fever with her hands steady and her eyes clear and no calculation in her face that he had ever been able to find. And he thought about November, and the November before that, and every year of his life that had been conducted in the language of management and control and the careful elimination of anything that could not be possessed. She looked up and saw him. She stopped. They stood in the dark corridor looking at each other, and the candlelight moved between them, and in the silence of Ravenspire, his estate, his name, his 40 years of construction, he felt the ground move for the third time, not collapsing. Something else. "The Duchess's brother is here," he said. "I know," Clara said. Mrs. Hartley told me. He looked at her face in the candlelight. Are you frightened? She considered it honestly, the way she considered everything. No, she said. Should I be? He thought about Evelyn's precision. He thought about Ashworth and Crane. He thought about the specific charge in the third paragraph of the letter, and what Evelyn would do with it in a public court, and what it would cost the woman standing in front of him to be named in that document in front of every aristocratic family in London. Yes, he said honestly. You should be. She held his gaze. The candle flickered. Then we should probably figure out what we're going to do about it. We. The words sat in the corridor between them with a weight that neither of them acknowledged directly, and the weight of it was the weight of everything that had accumulated in 9 nights in a linen storage room and the servants' hall and a carriage ride from London. And Lucian Blackthorne stood in the dark of his ancestral estate and understood that the man who had walked into this house before the fever was already gone. What came next was going to require someone different. He looked at Clara Whitmore in the candlelight and thought that the only person in Ravenspire who had seen that person clearly from the beginning was her. Come to the study, he said. We have a great deal to discuss. And somewhere below them, in the dining room, Evelyn Blackthorne sat with her brother and her wine, and the cold patience of a woman who had been building toward this for a year, and she listened to her husband's footsteps move down the corridor, and she understood, with the diagnostic precision that had always been her genuine gift, that she had miscalculated something. She was not certain yet what it was, but it had the quality of a variable she had not properly accounted for, and it lived in the sound of 2 sets of footsteps moving together through the dark house toward the same room. She picked up her wine glass, set it down, looked at her brother. We'll need to move faster, she said. The study felt different at night. Lucien had worked in this room for 15 years, signed documents, conducted negotiations, managed the estate's operational architecture through seasons and crises, and the grinding administrative reality of holding 200 years of accumulated property together through sheer force of attention. He knew every corner of it. The grain of the desk, the specific creak of the third floorboard from the window, the way the fire threw shadows across the portrait of his father that he had never bothered to remove because removing it would have implied the portrait still had power over him. He sat behind the desk now and watched Clara sit in the chair across from it. Not the chair of a supplicant, not positioned below him, but pulled to the side of the desk at an angle that was neither subordinate nor performatively equal, just practical. And he thought about the last time he had conducted a serious strategic conversation in this room with someone who was not managing their own anxiety while they spoke to him. He could not find the memory. It did not exist. Reeves, he said, my solicitor. He'll be here by morning. What Evelyn has built is architecturally sound, but it has a foundation problem. The November correspondence predates every event she's using as justification. That sequence matters legally. Clara was listening with the focused attention she brought to everything, her hand still in her lap, her eyes on his face. She'll argue the correspondence was precautionary, that the events of January confirmed what she had already feared. He looked at her. Yes. That's exactly what Ashworth and Crane will argue. So the sequence alone doesn't win it. No. The sequence creates doubt. Winning requires something else. He leaned forward. She needs witnesses. For the conduct charge to hold weight in a formal proceeding, she needs people who can describe specific behavior and characterize it. Fenwick has already provided documentation. The servants' hall incident is already on record through 3 witnesses. He paused. Edmund will testify if she asks him to. Clara absorbed this without visible reaction, which was its own kind of reaction. She was doing the calculation. He could see it, the precise movement of a mind working through the real shape of something rather than the shape she might prefer it to have. What does she actually want? Clara said. Not the legal case. What does she want out of this? He sat back. It was a better question than the ones he had been asking himself for the past 3 hours, and the fact that she had arrived at it first and directly told him something he was still in the process of learning about the difference between strategic intelligence and the kind that came from simply looking at things clearly. The northern properties, he said, and a settlement large enough to establish her brother's family in a position that removes any financial dependency on the Pemberton name. He paused. She wants out of this marriage with enough to never need to negotiate with anyone again. That's not unreasonable. No, he said. It's not. They sat with that. The fire moved. Outside, somewhere in the western wing, Evelyn and her brother were conducting their own version of this conversation, and the distance between the two studies, the geography of a marriage reduced to two people in separate rooms calculating what the other one needed, had a weight to it that pressed against the room. If you give her what she wants, Clara said carefully, the case goes away. Yes. And if you fight it, my name goes into the public record. Yes. She looked at him with those dark, clear eyes. Then give her what she wants. It's not that simple. Why not? Because what she wants includes a narrative, he said. The settlement requires a public accounting of grounds. Ashworth and Crane have already drafted the framing, a duke who neglected his marital obligations in favor of an inappropriate attachment to a servant. That narrative follows you for the rest of your life. It follows any future employment, any reference, any possibility of... He stopped. His jaw was tight. I'm not interested in purchasing my freedom at that cost. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face. Not the thing he expected, which would have been gratitude or the complicated distress of someone processing being protected. It was something more direct than either of those things. That's not your decision to make for me, she said. He met her eyes. I know what the narrative costs, she said. I've been a servant in houses like this one for 8 years. I know exactly how those narratives work and what they follow a woman through. She paused. And I'm telling you that if the alternative is watching you destroy what's left of your position, fighting a legal battle that Evelyn has had a year to build, the cost is mine to calculate. Clara, you asked me once why I stayed, she said, during the fever. You wanted to understand the reasoning, the calculus of it, what I was getting out of it. She leaned forward slightly. I stayed because it was the right thing to do, and because I had decided to do it. That decision was mine. This one is too. He looked at her face in the firelight. He thought about 9 nights and November letters, and the particular cost of being the woman whose name appeared in a duke's separation documents in 1887 in front of every aristocratic family in England. I won't let you carry that, he said. Then figure out a third option, she said. But figure it fast, because she told her brother tonight to move faster, and you know better than anyone what that means. He did know. Moving faster meant the public filing. Moving faster meant the newspaper contacts that Evelyn had maintained with the precise social foresight of a woman who had always understood that information was its own form of currency. Moving faster meant that by next week, the story would be in 3 London papers, and the narrative would be established before his solicitor had finished reading the November correspondence. He stood. He moved to the window. He stood looking out at the dark moors with his hands behind his back, and he thought with the stripped-down clarity that the last 2 months had scoured him to, not the 40 years of architecture, not the machinery of management and control, but the thing underneath all of it, the thing that had been sitting under the fever in the servants' hall and every conversation in the candlelit dark. He thought about what he was actually willing to lose. The answer was clarifying in its completeness. I'll be in London tomorrow, he said. Not for Reeves, for the morning edition. Clara went still behind him. What are you doing? She needs the public narrative, he said. She's built the entire strategy around it. The separation petition requires a sympathetic framing to move through the courts without a prolonged fight, and the sympathetic framing requires the story to be established before I can contest it. He turned from the window. So I'm going to give them a different story first. Lucien. His name in her mouth, direct and undecorated. She had never used it before. He watched her register that she had used it, and he watched her decide not to take it back. If you go to the press before the petition is formally filed, she will file it the same day. You lose the sequence advantage. There is no sequence advantage. Reeves told me this afternoon. Ashworth and Crane are filing Thursday. That's 2 days. Whatever I do, the petition is coming Thursday. Then what does going to London accomplish? The story that gets told first is the story that gets believed, he said. Not because truth is irrelevant, but because human beings organize their understanding around the first version of events they receive. Evelyn knows this. She's been planning the first version for a year. He picked up his pen from the desk, set it down. I'm going to walk into the Times office tomorrow morning, and I'm going to tell a journalist named Cartwright, who owes me a professional favor of sufficient weight, that he will print what I tell him. The story of a duchess who sealed herself into her tower while her husband was dying and retained a solicitor 2 months before the illness that was meant to provide her justification. Clara was quiet. Her face was doing the thing it did when she was working through something serious, the complete focused stillness. And me, she said. What version do you tell about me? The true one, he said. A servant who stayed when everyone else ran. Nothing more and nothing less than what actually happened. She looked at him for a long time. They won't print it that way. They'll print the version that sells. Cartwright will print it my way, or he doesn't print it at all. And I released the correspondence that ended his career in 1881 to the editor who's been looking for it since 1882. He said it simply, the way he said everything now. Not performing the ruthlessness, not constructed authority, just the plain statement of a man who has been in the machinery of power long enough to know exactly where every lever is. This is what I know how to do, Clara. This specific thing. I have spent 40 years learning the precise application of leverage. I am going to use it now. She held his gaze. In her expression, he saw the particular quality he had come to recognize over the past weeks. The honest assessment of a woman who did not perform reactions, who looked at things directly and responded to what was actually there. All right, she said. All right, he repeated. But I'm coming with you. He stopped. You're going to London to tell the true version of events, she said. I was there for most of it. If Cartwright asks questions, and he will ask questions, you need someone in the room who can confirm the account without hesitation and without the look of someone who's been coached. She paused. Also, if I stay here while you're gone, Evelyn will move. He looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the logistics of it. A duke and a servant girl arriving together at a London newspaper office. And he thought about what it would look like, and what it would mean, and what the cost of it was. Then he thought about November. He thought about 20 years of machinery. He thought about the specific quality of the decision he had made in the servants' hall that he had not fully understood when he made it. We leave at 6, he said. They were on the road by 5:30. The carriage moved through the pre-dawn dark of the countryside with the driver pushing reasonable speed, and Lucian sat across from Clara in the confined space of the carriage and watched the dark fields move past the window and felt, under everything, the strange, stripped-down aliveness of a man who has burned through all his contingency plans and is now operating on something more essential. He had sent word to Reeves the night before. He had left instructions with the one footman in the house whose loyalty he was confident of, not Fenwick's variety of loyalty, but the simpler kind, the kind that came from a young man named Briggs, who had been hired directly by Lucian 2 years ago and had not had time to develop the institution's particular complications. He had written a letter to Edmund that was 7 sentences and contained, with complete precision, what would happen to Edmund's proposed management of the northern properties if Edmund provided testimony in support of the separation petition. He had not written to Evelyn. He had nothing left to say to Evelyn that required paper. Clara had slept for the first 2 hours of the journey. Real sleep, the deep kind. Her head tilted against the carriage wall and her hands folded in her lap. And he had watched her sleep with the attention of a man cataloging something he was not yet accustomed to having access to. She had the face of a person who was genuinely at peace with the decision she had made, and the peace of it was not the peace of someone who had been reassured. It was the peace of someone who had done their own accounting. She woke when the carriage hit the rougher road outside the city and looked at him with the immediate alertness he had first seen on the 3rd morning, and she took in the gray pre-dawn light and his face and the proximity of London without particular distress. You didn't sleep, she said. I don't sleep much under normal circumstances. These aren't normal circumstances. No, he agreed. She looked at him. Are you frightened? He considered it honestly, as she had taught him to consider things. No. I've been frightened twice in my life. Once when my father died, and I understood what it meant to be responsible for all of it. Once during the fever, for approximately 4 seconds, before I decided that fear was not productive. He paused. What I feel now is different. What is it? He looked out the window at the gray lightening London sky, the city assembling itself out of the dark in the familiar shapes of rooftops and chimneys, and the particular density of a place where several million people had decided to conduct their lives in proximity. Like I know exactly what I'm doing and exactly what it costs, and I'm doing it anyway, he said. That's not fear. That's something else. She was quiet for a moment, then, my father called that clarity. He looked at her. Your father sounds like he was a very intelligent man. He was, she said. He also died broke and exhausted at 53, so clarity is not without its complications. He almost smiled. It had the same quality as the almost smile during the fever, the foreign sensation of an expression that lived on someone else's face finding its way to his. They arrived at Cartwright's office at 8:30. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. Cartwright was 60, ink-stained, with the sharp, attentive eyes of a man who had spent 4 decades deciding which version of which story was worth the paper it required. He looked at Lucien when he entered. He looked at Clara. He made his rapid journalist's assessment of what the two of them in the same room at 9 in the morning meant, and Lucien watched the assessment happen and watched Cartwright file it, and then Cartwright poured 2 cups of tea and sat down and said, "Talk." Lucien talked. He talked with the precision and economy of a man who knew exactly what needed to be said and what did not, and he laid out the sequence: the fever, the abandonment, the November letters, the separation petition, and its fraudulent timeline, with the clean factual authority of someone who has the documentation to support every claim. Cartwright asked questions, sharp, probing, the questions of a man who has been lied to professionally for 40 years and has developed exquisite sensitivity to the difference between a story someone once told and a story that is true. At one point, he looked at Clara and asked directly, "You were in his chambers for 9 nights during a potentially fatal illness. How do you characterize what happened?" Clara looked at him without hesitation. "A man was dying and everyone who was supposed to be there left," she said. "I characterized it at the time as something that needed to be addressed. I characterize it now the same way." Cartwright looked at her for a long moment. He wrote something in his notebook. At the end of the meeting, he leaned back in his chair and looked at Lucien with the expression of a man calculating multiple things simultaneously. "This prints Thursday morning," he said. "Full account, your documentation referenced. The Pemberton correspondence gets its own paragraph." A pause. "The girl's name stays out of it." "Her name is Clara Whitmore," Lucien said, "and that's her decision." Cartwright looked at Clara. Clara looked at Cartwright. "Leave it out," she said. They were back in the carriage by 10. Lucien sat in the familiar position, back straight, hands in his lap, and felt the specific quality of a man who has just done something that cannot be undone. The story would print Thursday. The petition would file Thursday. The 2 documents would arrive in the public consciousness simultaneously, and the question of which one shaped the narrative depended on how well Cartwright wrote and how fast Ashworth and Crane moved, and there was nothing left to do about either of those variables. He had used his last piece of leverage. He had placed his final bet. He was aware, with complete clarity, that he had placed it not on the machinery or the estate or the title or any of the 40 years of construction, but on the plain account of 9 nights in a quarantined room and the specific quality of a woman who had stayed. "It's done," Clara said. "It's done," he agreed. She looked at him across the carriage with the morning light coming through the window behind her, and he looked back at her, and the space between them held everything that had accumulated since the 3rd morning when she walked through a quarantine door and changed the entire architecture of what he thought survival required. "Whatever happens Thursday," she said. "Whatever happens Thursday," he said. The carriage moved through the London streets toward the road north, and behind them the city was already moving into the business of the day. And somewhere in it Cartwright was writing, and somewhere in it Ashworth and Crane were completing their filing, and somewhere in a London club Lord Aldrich Pemberton was receiving the message that Lucien had sent that morning. Short, exact, containing only the date range of the November correspondence and the name of the editor who had been looking for the 1881 documents for 6 years. And in Ravenspire, in the Western Wing, Evelyn Blackthorne was reading the letter that Briggs had delivered at 7 that morning on Lucien's instruction. The letter contained 2 sentences. The first was, "I know about November." The second was, "Be at the house on Thursday. Bring your solicitor. I'll be bringing mine, and a journalist, and every letter your brother has sent you since last autumn." She read it twice. She set it on the table. She looked at the window and the January moors beyond it. Then she did something she had not done in a very long time. She made a decision not based on calculation. She picked up her pen and wrote to Edmund, and what she wrote was not a strategy or an instruction, but a single question that had been sitting behind everything for 20 years. The question she had never asked, because asking it would have required admitting that the answer mattered to her. She sealed it before she could reconsider. She gave it to her maid to send. And in London, the carriage carrying Lucien Blackthorne and Clara Whitmore moved north through the grey morning, and Thursday was 2 days away. and everything that had been built and everything that had been destroyed was about to walk into the same room and find out what was left. Thursday arrived the way reckonings always do, not with weather or portent, but with ordinary light through ordinary windows, the kind of morning that makes no promises about what it intends to hold. Lucien was dressed by 6. He stood at the window of his study looking at the frost on the moors, and he thought about the specific quality of a man who has placed every remaining piece on the board and is now simply waiting to see what the board does with them. He had spent 40 years avoiding this sensation, the complete absence of reserve, the nakedness of a position where there is nothing held back because there is nothing left to hold. He had built his entire life around the management of exposure, the careful maintenance of more than the other party knew about, more leverage than had been deployed, more room to maneuver than was visible. There was no room left now. He had used the November correspondence. He had used Cartwright. He had used the letter to Edmund and the message to Pemberton. And what remained was the man himself and the truth of 9 weeks and whatever Evelyn brought into the room this morning when she came. He found, standing at the window in the early frost light, that the nakedness did not feel the way he had spent 40 years assuming it would feel. He had avoided it because he had believed, with the certainty of a man who had confused his own architecture for wisdom, that exposure was indistinguishable from weakness. What he felt instead was something closer to the air after a storm. Scoured, present, honest in the way that only things stripped to their actual material can be honest. He heard the carriages on the drive at 9:30. 2 of them. Eveline returning from wherever she had spent Wednesday night, and behind it a second carriage that would be Ashworth and Crane. Reeves arrived at 9:10, which meant Lucien Jessemistien had 20 minutes with his own solicitor before the room filled with everyone else. Reeves was 55, compact, with the permanently skeptical expression of a man who had spent 3 decades assuming that every client had told him approximately 70% of the relevant information and adjusting his strategy for the missing 30. He looked at Lucien across the study desk and said, "The Times piece ran this morning." "I know." Cartwright characterized it fairly. "I know." Ashworth and Crane will argue it as an attempt to prejudice the proceedings. "They'll argue it. They won't win it." Lucien looked at his solicitor directly. "The November correspondence is dated. The sequence is factual. There is nothing in the Times piece that is not documentable." Reeves nodded slowly. "The girl is not named." "No." "That was her choice?" "Yes." Reeves looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man revising his 30% missing estimate. "All right," he said, "then here's where we are." He laid it out with the clean efficiency of someone who understood that his client did not require softening. The petition, as filed, was technically sound but strategically dependent on the conduct narrative. Without the conduct narrative, without the ability to characterize Lucien's behavior during and after the illness as grounds, Eveline's case reduced to a property dispute that would take 3 years to resolve in a court that would ultimately preserve most of the estate's structure under existing entailment law. "She knows this," Lucy said. "Yes, which is why she filed before the Times piece, and why her team spent yesterday evening trying to get Cartwright's piece pulled before distribution." Reeves paused. "They didn't succeed." "No, they wouldn't. The question this morning is whether she negotiates or fights." Reeves looked at him. "What do you want?" Lucien was quiet for a moment. He thought about what he had wanted 3 weeks ago, which was the restoration of the machinery, the estate intact, the title intact, the careful architecture of his life reassembled around him like stone that had temporarily shifted in an earthquake. He thought about what he had wanted 2 weeks ago, which was to protect Clara from the narrative at whatever cost. He thought about what he had wanted in London, sitting across from Cartwright with the morning light coming through the office windows, and Clara's voice saying the plain true thing without hesitation. "I want it finished," he said. "Cleanly. Whatever she needs to walk out of this marriage with enough that she never has to negotiate with anyone again. I'll give her that. The northern properties, a settlement of her choosing within reason, her freedom." He paused. "What I will not give her is the narrative. I will not let the official record characterize what happened in this house as something it wasn't." Reeves wrote something. "And the servant. Her name is Clara Whitmore. She is a member of this household staff, and she will remain so for as long as she chooses. That is not a negotiating point." Reeves looked at him for a long moment. Then he wrote something else, closed his notebook, and said, "Let's go meet them." The drawing room held everyone by 10 o'clock. Eveline sat on the far side with Ashworth, senior partner, 70 years old, the architecture of whose face suggested he had negotiated more endings than most people had witnessed, and a younger associate whose name Lucian did not know. Pemberton was not present, which meant Evelyn had made a decision about how she wanted the room to read. His absence was its own signal. Edmund was not present either. Lucian had not expected him to be. Evelyn looked, he thought, tired. Not defeated. Evelyn was not built for defeat as a primary response, but the specific tiredness of a woman who has been carrying a heavy plan for a long time and is close enough to the end of it that she can feel the weight in her bones. She wore black wool, her hair precise, her posture what it always was. But the tiredness was there, and he looked at it honestly, and he thought about 20 years with the same diagnostic attention he had been applying to everything since the fever. He thought about the letter she had written Edmund. He did not know what it contained. He knew only that she had written it. Briggs had seen it go out, and that its existence meant something had shifted in Evelyn in the 24 hours before this meeting that was not purely strategic. They sat. Reeves and Ashworth exchanged the particular professional courtesies of two men who had been in rooms like this together before and understood the language. Then Ashworth looked at Lucian and said, "The Times piece complicates things." "It was designed to," Lucian said. Evelyn looked at him. Her expression was precise and controlled and had, at its edges, something that was neither warmth nor hostility, but the particular quality of a person who is tired of the performance and is choosing, in this specific room, to put some of it down. "You move faster than I expected," she said. "You taught me to move fast," he said. 20 years of watching you. You were always the better strategist." Something moved across her face. It was not a smile. It was something more complicated than a smile. The involuntary register of a person receiving an honest acknowledgement of something they had spent years pretending not to need. "Then you know," she said, "that the strategy is over." "Yes," he said. Ashworth began to speak, the formal language of negotiated terms, the framework of what his client required, and Lucian let him speak and listened with genuine attention because the terms were not unreasonable. The northern properties, a financial settlement, a formal separation deed that characterized the grounds in mutually agreed language that would become the official record. The language of the grounds was where it lived. That was the only real battlefield remaining. Ashworth's draft described irreconcilable differences of character and conduct arising from the Duke's illness and subsequent household decisions. Reeves looked at Lucian. Lucian looked at Evelyn. "No," he said. Ashworth paused. "Not that language," Lucian said. "The illness is not the source of the irreconcilable differences. The illness revealed them. There's a distinction, and it matters for the record." He kept his eyes on Evelyn's face. "What I'll accept is this. The separation arose from fundamental incompatibilities of purpose and expectation that predated the events of January and were clarified by them. No characterization of conduct, no narrative about the household, just the plain truth. We were not suited to each other, and we spent 20 years not admitting it." The room was quiet. Ashworth looked at Evelyn. She looked at the window. She looked at her hands. She looked at Lucian with the expression of a woman having a conversation she had been having in her own head for a year and is now having aloud for the first time. "You want the record to protect her," she said. "I want the record to be true," he said. The two things happened to coincide. Another silence. Evelyn looked at the window again. Outside, the January moors were white and still and indifferent to everything occurring in the drawing room of the estate that bore the Blackthorn name. "All right," she said. Ashworth turned to look at his client with the measured surprise of a man recalculating. Reeves was writing. "The northern properties," Evelyn said. "The settlement is outlined, and the language as you've proposed." She paused. "I want one thing added." "Name it," Lucian said. "Edmund." She looked at him directly. "He will not contest this. He will not use the separation as leverage for the estate management proposal. Whatever you've written to him, make it permanent." He looked at his wife. He thought about the letter she had sent Edmund, the one that had gone out Wednesday morning, the one that was not strategy. He thought about what a mother writes to a son when the performance falls away. He thought about what Evelyn, underneath all the machinery of the past 20 years, had been protecting in the only language she had ever been taught to use. "Done," he said. Reeves wrote. Ashworth wrote. The room conducted the formal business of ending a 20-year marriage in the specific language of people who have decided to be honest in the final accounting, even if they were not always honest in the years before it. When it was finished, the signatures, the seals, the formal exchanges, Evelyn stood. Lucien stood. They looked at each other across the drawing room with the accumulated weight of 20 years between them, and he thought about all of it. The contract and the machinery and the November letters and the Western Tower and every conversation they had not had because they had both been too committed to their own architecture to be present in the actual room. "I didn't hate you," she said. Her voice was even. It was simply true. "I know," he said. "I didn't hate you either. That was almost the worst part of it." He held her gaze. "Yes," he said, "it was." She left with Ashworth and the associate, and the drawing room held its new quiet, and Reeves gathered his papers with the efficient discretion of a man who understood that some rooms needed to be vacated promptly after the work in them was done. Lucien stood alone in the drawing room for a long time. He stood in the room where he had hosted dinners and conducted negotiations and managed the social machinery of a title and an estate for 15 years, and he looked at the walls and the furniture and the portrait above the fireplace. Not his father this time, but a Blackthorn ancestor from 2 centuries ago, some predecessor whose name he had memorized for formal occasions, and whose face had always looked, he thought now, like a man performing a confidence he did not entirely possess. He understood that face differently today. He found Clara in the garden. She had not been inside during the meeting. He had not asked her to be, and she had not offered. She had simply been absent from the house in the particular way she had of removing herself from situations that were not hers to occupy. And he had understood it and not tried to change it. She was in the kitchen garden at the east side of the house, which in January was bare and frost-hardened, but which she had apparently found preferable to the interior of the estate during the morning's proceedings. She was standing near the stone wall with her coat on and her breath visible in the cold air, looking at nothing specific with the focused inner attention of a person who has been doing serious thinking. She heard his step on the frozen ground and turned. He looked at her face, and she looked at his. And whatever she found there told her what she needed to know before he spoke, because her expression settled into something quiet and real. "It's done," he said. "Yes," she said. Not a question. He stopped a few feet from her. The cold air was sharp and honest, the way cold air in January is honest.